lot of days that I prayed and I hoped and I was speaking everything into existence. I said, I have faith that he will be convicted. It's been a long journey.
That was George Floyd's brother reacting to the guilty verdict against Derek Chauvin. Now we want to see how many years Chauvin will spend in prison. So let's take a closer look at the jury's decision from yesterday. We are joined by criminal defense attorney Dave Thomas from Taft Law. Good morning to you. Thanks for being here. Let's talk about the jury first. They reached their verdict in about 10 hours. So in your professional experience, what does that time frame say about deliberations?
Well, so it's relatively short compared to the complexity of the case. You know, it took several weeks to present the evidence. There were experts, eyewitnesses. It shows that the jury was thorough, but also very intentional, that they had enough time to review the evidence and consider Judge Cahill's instructions, but also that there wasn't a lot of disagreement among the jurors.
And this verdict, what does this mean for any future cases involving deaths at the hands of police, in your opinion?
Well, it sends a message. You know, one of the purposes of the criminal justice system is deterrence, and there's two kinds. There's something called specific deterrence that refers to Derek Chauvin, but there's also general deterrence, and that's the message that's sent to people who may act in the future. And it's impossible to walk away from this case without thinking about the general deterrence this will have on police uses of force against citizens.
And we all saw over and over again the more than 9 minutes that Chauvin had his knee on Floyd's neck. Do you think having that video from a bystander played a big role in what we saw, the guilty verdicts?
Absolutely. There's just no way to watch those videos and the one in particular not be struck by the length of time that this took. And it's something that Judge Cahill is probably going to take into account as well. One of the sentencing factors in Minnesota refers to whether the defendant acted with particular cruelty. And you know, that's surely something the state will be bringing to the judge's attention as he considers a sentence in this case.
Yeah, let's talk about the sentencing process. We should find out in a matter of weeks, maybe 2 months. With those 3 guilty charges, what else will that judge take into account when imposing how many years Chauvin will spend in prison, and how many years could he spend in prison?
So he faces up to 40 years in prison, and that's for a couple of reasons. So one are factors that relate generally to any case like this. And so that's the defendant's background, history, you know, his unique characteristics. But then also in this case, the prosecutors have asked the judge to take into account some aggravating factors that take his potential sentence from about 12 and a half years up to potentially 40. And that is, number one, that the crime was committed in the presence of children. Number two, that it was done with particular cruelty. And number three, that he abused a position of trust, and specifically that his role at the time as a law enforcement officer helped him do it. So the judge will take all that into account and can impose a sentence anywhere up to 40 years.
All right, Dave Thomas, we have a lot more questions for you this morning. We're going to talk to you in about an hour, so we'll check back in with you shortly. Thank you so much for your time. Angela?
Sure.
A fight for justice ends with a guilty verdict. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin could spend 40 or more years behind bars for killing George Floyd last May. A judge will decide his sentence in 8 weeks. Now, the jury reached that verdict fairly quickly, in just about 10 hours. So what exactly went into those deliberations? Well, joining us now is a criminal defense attorney, Dave Thomas. He's from the Taft Law Firm here in Columbus. Dave, good morning. Thanks for being here to answer some of our questions.
Good morning.
Good morning. So let's talk first. People say this case really set a precedent in the age of social media because of all the video that was available. That was, some say, the winning strategy for prosecutors because they told the jury, believe in their eyes, which really plays more to emotion than evidence. What do you think?
Well, it was clearly a winning strategy given the outcome. What I would say is that video is evidence. It's a real-time recording of what happened, and without the video, we would have been left with the subjective accounts and recollections of the eyewitnesses. So it was effective, and it was clearly very important here.
You know, Minnesota has a unique spark of life doctrine that allowed evidence about George Floyd's life into this trial. What role do you think that played into the guilty verdicts?
It was compelling when I heard the testimony about George Floyd's life, from being a father to his relationship with his brother, his work at the Salvation Army. It was incredibly compelling, and it must have been compelling for the jurors as well to hear about the kind of person he was, complicated, but also a real human.
And again, part of the prosecution strategy there. Let's talk about what is next here, Dave, this sentencing phase. I have two questions for you. First, with the 3 guilty verdicts, so there were 3 different verdicts, and each has a different number of years that Chauvin could face for each of these verdicts, where there was like 40 years, 25, and another 10. So collectively 75, but we're hearing the max that Derek Chauvin could get is 40 years. Why is that?
So there's a legal and a constitutional provision called merger. And the idea is that a person cannot be punished multiple times for one act. And so Derek Chauvin can only be punished once for the death of George Floyd. And so the judge will only consider the maximum charge, which is the second-degree murder.
And talk about the discretion that the judge has in order to perhaps go higher or lower than those guidelines when it comes to how many years he could spend in prison.
Yeah, that's a really interesting part of the case. And so Minnesota has what are called sentencing guidelines. And so Judge Cahill may, if he chooses, impose a sentence anywhere from 0 to 40 years. But his decision will be guided by some very specific guidelines that exist under Minnesota law. On the surface, it begins with 12 and a half years as a likely sentence. But then there are certain aggravating factors that Judge Cahill can consider. And in particular, there are 3 that really stand out in this case. The first is that the crime was committed in the presence of children. Children took the video in this case, among others. Second, that the crime was committed with particular cruelty. And you can't see this case without seeing the 9.5 minutes that it took for this to happen.
Sure.
And then finally, Judge Cahill will consider whether the defendant abused a position of authority in carrying this out. And so Judge Cahill may, if he chooses, take all of those factors into consideration in imposing a sentence greater than the 12 and a half years.
Well, Dave, that's a great explanation behind that. So a lot of us are just waiting, and the world is waiting really to see what will happen when that judge does bring down that sentence in 8 weeks. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.